We're live. Good evening, everyone. Pleasure it is to be here at the Antique Boat Museum. My name is Constance Barone, and I grew up in Sackets Harbor. I'm going to be speaking about Sackets Harbor's Horse Island. I went away for a museum career for a number of years, came back to Sackets Harbor with my husband, and I am the site manager at the Sackets Harbor Battlefield State Historic Site. My presentation tonight is about Horse Island, and it was my husband's suggestion that I focus on Horse Island. It has such a fascinating history in so many different ways, and I hope you're going to enjoy hearing about that this evening. Sackets Harbor's strategic location on the eastern end of Lake Ontario made it the only possible site for the American military command during the War of 1812. This natural harbor, located in Haudenosaunee territory, became a hub of activity for shipbuilding, drawing thousands of personnel, and a place to amass war material. So in northern New York, Sackets Harbor became the site of both offensive and defensive actions during the War of 1812. Horse Island, linked to Sackets Harbor's mainland by a submerged causeway, played a significant role in the 29 May 1813 Second Battle of Sackets Harbor. Later, lighthouse keepers and their families called it home on Black River Bay. The National Park Service designated Sackets Harbor as one of the top 2 War of 1812 sites in the nation due to the 1813 battle, the results of it, and today the continued concern over battlegrounds development, loss of land. In 2017, the American Battlefield Trust recognized the island's multinational significance and made the island and mainland parcel their first War of 1812 acquisitions in the country. And consequently, now New York State Parks holds a unique island central to our whole heritage. So these are the themes that I'll be covering. Very diverse, as you can see, from indigenous people, War of 1812, lighthouses, archaeology. So quite a broad cross-section. The indigenous people, they hunted, fished at the eastern shore of Lake Ontario. Today, Kahenkoeta is a Native American pathway archaeological district. The lake, as a thoroughfare, allowed early cultures of the late woodland and Iroquois cultures to exchange ideas as they traveled the waterways. Lake Ontario is an environment where the Onondaga people lived, fished, hunted, and gathered for thousands of years. Now, several years ago, Joseph Heath, an attorney with the Onondaga Nation in the General Council, said, quote, "The cultural, spiritual, historic, archaeological, and environmental connections of the Onondaga Nation and of the Haudenosaunee to Lake Ontario and its eastern shore is undeniable. But unfortunately, it is not currently well known," end quote. A bit on early settlement. And this is a portrait of Augusta Sackett and 1864 map, a little bit later, 1864 map of the village. So first of all, we do not know the name, where the name Horse Island came for this 24-acre island. So if there's someone in the audience who knows that, we would be delighted to know where the name Horse Island came from. As settlers arrived in Mr. Sackets Harbor, Thomas L. Ogden owned the island. Squire Reed's farm, located on the mainland opposite Horse Island, was ground zero in the spring of 1813 when the battle unfolded. And consequently, both U.S. and enemy forces destroyed his farm, home, ashery, and his whole premises. And for years, Squire Reed's descendants tried to claim compensation for damages from the federal government. This particular map that's on the right side of the screen is one that has really just come to light in the last few years, because this was in the Elijah Camp home. Elijah Camp being the co-founder of the village of Sackets Harbor. And his archive collection now has gone to Cornell University. But this map, it was really quite spectacular to see, with the drawings of where the plots of land were laid out. And in the bottom left corner of that map, some of you may recognize the Augusta Sackett home, which is today the Village Visitor Center. A really beautiful map. And a little bit later, we have 1835, the development of Sackets Harbor. And that squiggly line that starts down here on the corner and goes across the village, that is Camp's Ditch, and that was a waterway for water power to the mills in the downtown area. Now, the War of 1812. So fortunately, in addition to a recent cultural resources survey on the island, there exist many primary historical documents recounting the battle in the form of diaries, letters, military logs, and published recollections. Before dawn, 29 May 1813, the British-Canadian 33-troop-laden bateau and birch canoes of the Mohawk and Mississauga moved toward the Sackets Harbor mainland directly southwest of Horse Island, precisely as the Americans had anticipated. And I've put an X there, a red X, because this is the sort of the arrival point of the Crown forces as they're heading towards Sackets Harbor, and particularly Horse Island. Horse Island looks rather large in this drawing. And the view, the contemporary view, is from that location. So it's out on the water, looking at that little corner of Horse Island with the village way in the background. About 3 weeks prior to that May battle, several hundred men of the Albany Volunteers under Colonel John Mills established Camp Volunteer to defend the island. And there were men and a 6-pounder cannon on the mainland shore, northeast of that important submerged causeway. Causeway plays a significant role here. Joining Mills on the island was Captain Kellogg's Volunteer Artillery Company, positioned one of their 6-pounder cannon there as well. So on the fateful May date, Brigadier General Jacob Brown commanded the New York militia and volunteers, and he positioned Lieutenant Colonels Tuttle and Sprague's New York militia battalions along the shore of the mainland, southwest of the causeway. The sketchy map there on the right is by Macomb. So 2 British gunboats led in the 4 a.m. assault, providing covering fire for the amphibious assault. Detected by the Americans, these boats received devastating musket and cannon shot. The landing plan changed then to the north side of the island after the invading forces sustained many casualties out on the water. With the Crown forces, Voltigeur Canadien Jacques Vigier reported, quote, "We were advancing slowly and with little noise along the canal which divides Horse Island from the mainland," he means the causeway, "thinking about taking the enemy by surprise, when, perfectly awake and on guard, we found it, the militia, scattered over the 2 shores and posted behind the trees which bordered them," end quote. Jacques Vigier is describing the 2 shores as on the island and mainland. And this is a critical juncture as the battle unfolds. Once on the island, the British quickly drove the volunteers to the mainland, with Colonel Edward Baines ordering a bayonet charge across the causeway, led by the 100th Regiment of Foot, along with elements of the Royal Scots and the 8th Regiment of Foot. Now, on this slide is a copy of one page of a letter that was written to the widow of Lieutenant Colonel Electus Bacchus. But I'm going to refer to someone else who lost his life at that beginning of the battle. So on the mainland shore of the causeway, General Brown's militia fired one volley before they abandoned the Albany volunteers to face the brunt of the British charge alone. Consequently, Lieutenant Colonel Mills was killed in the assault, supporting fire from 2 British gunboats. Next, Major John Herkimer assumed command. After his troops fired 4 musket volleys into the British column, a tactical withdrawal began to link up with the American regulars to the northeast, and this is on the mainland. After about a 3-hour engagement, the invaders retreated, again making use of Horse Island, where they took time to help themselves in the abandoned Camp Volunteer. So they were pillaging Camp Volunteer as they left. The map on the left-hand side is by Jacques Viget, done later in 1839, his recollections of the day of the battle. And the sort of the yellowish-looking map on the right side, that is Macomb's map of 1812. The Jacques Viget map, this is the full-size map. The island's importance included a British casualty treatment and evacuation point on the southeast side by the causeway, where Voltigeurs surgeon Dr. Toussaint Casimir Truteau tended the Crown forces wounded and dying. Eventually, in late afternoon, they loaded the wounded onto the boats for the return trip to Kingston, Upper Canada. And just an aside comment, the Crown Forces men who were killed at the battle and left behind were buried by the Americans. And today we have a monument that recognizes those 40-some men, their names, their rank, the units that they served with. So today, military staff rides are common at the historic site. They follow along the battle route. They stop at the island's mainland shore. And these 2 views are on the mainland, looking across to Horse Island. The image on the left, you can see a bit of the causeway, the rocks, the boulders that are above the level of the water. Here, the soldiers study the terrain and the logistics for something which is called lessons learned. Now we move forward in time. We have the 19th century. This map, or this photograph rather, has to be after 1947, because on the bluff where today's historic site is located, which I know you can't see because it's very tiny, is the reproduction blockhouse. And we know that was built in 1947-48 because one of my grandfathers put the plumbing in the building. So over the next 200 years, this is after the War of 1812, despite changes and improvements to the facilities at Sackets Harbor in and around the harbor, there appears to have been little in the way of major improvements on Horse Island, where the landing and troop movement focused on the opposite mainland shore. This map we just discovered a few years ago. So of interest is this railroad depot plan that was proposed in 1853, and the map shows extensive railroad rail shipping complex where rail lines would have crossed from the mainland to a series of wharfs where vessels would load and unload freight. And fortunately, the plan did not materialize. In 2017, the American Battlefield Trust bought the island and a portion of the mainland opposite the island from the Martin family. This was the Trust's very first War of 18 battlegrounds purchased in the country. And subsequently, the land became part of the New York State Parks system. So now we're moving on to the story of lighthouses. Actually, there were two. So, yes, go ahead.
One clarification, the causeway,
The causeway?
was that man-made or was that a natural?
It was
appeared
natural.
High water, low water?
Right, it was natural, and then it was manipulated later to become an actual roadway. And I do have a little bit about that coming up.
Oh, good.
So, yes, and it's something we still want to learn more about. So after a more lasting peace had been achieved, in 1831, Mr. Ogden sold the island to the federal government for $500. And they built a $4,000 lighthouse with a beacon which could be seen as far as 13 miles away. The first lighthouse keeper, Samuel McNitt, had been a captain with the militia during the Battle of Sackets Harbor, and he became the first lighthouse keeper. So we have a range of date here. This was between 1835 and 1860. So a time range there. And this is an image on the right-hand side of the screen of his tombstone, which is in Lakeside Cemetery in Sackets Harbor. A cluster of images here about the lighthouse. So the light was upgraded in 1857 with a fifth order Fresnel lens. And in 1870, the new brick structure replaced the lighthouse 300 yards southeast of its predecessor. The lighthouse square tower received a 10-foot addition in 1899, raising it to 55.5 feet tall. So a variety. And you can see in these images that the island had all of the foliage had been removed, the trees have been removed. And we're still looking at understanding what was happening during the War of 1812, how much of the foliage had been removed or not. So those are continuing questions for us to explore. And a bit here about the keepers. So as I mentioned, Samuel McNitt first, and then somewhere in between was Lorenzo Root, and then McNitt's name comes back again. Orville Westcott, Mr. McFarland, and Mr. Meeks. A Civil War veteran, Horace Holloway, was lightkeeper, and he passed away in 1920 at the age of 84. George Ward was keeper in 1909 to 1926, and his wife was the daughter of Holloway, who had preceded him as lighthouse keeper. There was a story about the family rescuing a boatload of people when the boat struck the island in 1918. A little bit more information we have on Schuyler Simmons, keeper from 1926 to 33. And interesting, after his death, his wife Julia took over as keeper. And she farmed the land of 17 acres, so 1933 to 35. Julia kept a horse, a cow, a young bull that was, as they say, friendly as a house dog, and a flock of Plymouth Rock chickens that were so tame that they would perch on her shoulders, which is why we have the image over here about of a Plymouth Rock chicken. So your question about the causeway, we know that when the keepers were on the island and there was farming, that yes, there was a roadway to get back and forth. And a little bit more on that. In 1925, the light changed from a fixed oil light to an automated flashing acetylene light. And in this image, the two photos on the right-hand side are about 2016 or 17 images that were prepared when the island went up for sale. And here we're coming back a little bit to that causeway item. So the following year, which would be 1926, the lake water level was so low that vehicles could be driven across the causeway to and from the island. The roadway may have existed earlier, we're not sure, but we do know from oral history that a teenager around the year 1929 was hired to work with other young men building up the causeway, and they would dive under the water and grab rocks and move them up to reinforce that roadway. And now you know, of course, today the water level is very low, and so our maintenance people have been just walking back and forth with hip waders. So back and forth today because the water right now is so low. Now, I don't think you can see very well. There's the metal light tower, the Coast Guard light tower. There's enlargement of the tower, the top, the platform. I don't know if you can tell, but there are at least 3 osprey nests in there. So sort of an osprey apartment house that they've created. So 1957 and 58, the automated light on the metal skeletal tower replaced the function of the lighthouse. The island was sold in December 1958 by the General Services Administration to the Carl Martin family. And at that time, it was suggested a bird sanctuary be proposed. And a little further in the program, we'll speak a bit about the natural history. Now, moving on to archaeology. So in 2019, not that long ago, the National Park Service American Battlefield Protection Program funded a detailed historical and military terrain analysis of the island by SUNY Binghamton's Public Archaeology Facility. The goal of the archaeology survey was to identify the location of principal sites such as the British landing, along with any engagement between British and Americans on the island. So just over 200 years after the battle, these archaeologists reported evidence clearly indicating Americans and British sniping at each other prior to British forces landing on and near the island, while the Americans were withdrawing as planned and the British advancing over the causeway. The archaeologists used an analysis tool called KOCOA, K-O-C-O-A. And I have enumerated here in text on the left-hand side some of the key components of their study. And this is what they would be looking at. So key terrain, concealment, etc. The archaeologists used the KOCOA analysis tool that seeks to see a battle commander's view of the battlefield. The report states, quote, the American resistance and eventual withdrawal from Horse Island is documented in the primary accounts from both the British and American viewpoint. And today, the positions of dropped British 68 caliber and 69 caliber lead balls and fired American 64 caliber lead balls shows this. The recovered lead balls indicate what the primary documents recorded. The British force landed on the north and northeastern shore of the island. The clustering of American dropped lead balls shows Americans attempted to resist, end quote. Quote, the position of British dropped lead balls near the landing area indicates the landing was successful and the British firing line established, and pushed the Albany Volunteers southeast toward the causeway off the island. A single British dropped musket ball on the western side of the island and 2 fired American lead balls may represent British skirmishers along the British right flank, clearing the Americans from the island. British drop balls funneled towards the causeway as it began the advance to the main shoreline. End quote. Overall, using primary documents in today's archaeology methods, such as COCOA, we learned, quote, during the retreat, Captain Jacques Vigier, Principal Provincial Corps of Light Infantry, Canadian Voltigeurs, noted that an American camp with tents, Camp Volunteer, was discovered and pillaged by British forces before embarking on their boats to return to the British fleet, end quote. And, quote again, American Private Balthasar Kramer wrote to his wife that the Albany Volunteers had lost their clothing and belongings when they had retreated from the island. The campsite is a defining feature of Horse Island, end quote. The archaeologists reported to us, quote, GIS military analysis applications provided an interpretive model of British gunboat firing positions during the approach prior to the troop landings on Horse Island, and the American firing positions on the island and their range of fire, the approximate locations of disembarking British troops, and predicted American rifle positions on the main shore flanking the causeway, end quote. So GIS is a computer system that analyzes and displays geographically referenced information. And here I wanted to thank many archaeologists who have worked at Sackets Harbor over the last 70 years on the island and underwater, adding to this knowledge base. And we have two people here in the audience this evening who have done a lot of research and assisting us at Sackets Harbor. So thank you, McCarthy's. Now, you've probably heard about the Great Lakes Underwater Sanctuary program. This is by NOAA. Sackets Harbor Battlefield State Historic Site falls within NOAA's proposed Great Lakes National Marine Sanctuary Plan. The Sackets Harbor region boasts a long history of human engagement with the maritime environment. And the State Historic Site specifically interprets the tumultuous early history of our nation and the War of 1812. Results from archaeologically surveying the mainland, Horse Island, and past offshore underwater areas support research and contributes to the understanding of the 1813 Second Battle of Sackets Harbor. These archaeology and cultural resources surveys contribute to ongoing scholarship and offer additional opportunities for our site visitors and our community members. I really like this photograph and have never figured out where exactly it was taken from, because the cliffs are to your left and the photographer is hovering over the water somehow taking this photograph. So I would like to figure that out someday. The island's natural environment remains relatively undisturbed, with little public access during the private ownership from 1957 to 2017, which is about 60 years. And geographically, Horse Island and its mainland connection, as we pointed out, bridge the divide between nature and culture. So here, geology, human history, and climate converge, creating this diverse habitat. The island offers exceptional bird watching for eagles, kingfisher, plover, saw osprey and mallards. And just last month, when I was kayaking around the island, I watched two mature eagles rise up above the island, beginning to spar with each other in the air, and then seeming to be quite happy, then flying off beside each other toward Henderson. So each aspect of the landscape, the cultural, the environmental, and the physical, is interrelated. And in maritime cultural landscape, individual sites are treated as features within the larger landscape. The individual places make up a larger region. So the link between the land and the water, between the prehistoric and the historic, provide a different way of looking at a place simply called Horse Island. And archaeologist Ben Ford's work on coastal archaeology is a good source to explore this topic. A planned environmental management approach will protect native habitats, biodiversity, and freshwater resources. This dovetails perfectly with the New York State Park's goal to manage the island for recreational use while preserving cultural, archaeological, and historic resources, the lighthouse keeper's home. This outdoor experience can be explored on preserved land open to the public. The island and contiguous mainland property connect us all to our shared heritage, a place of delight, adventure, curiosity, and beauty. So we've looked at the geography of the island, the multiple cultural and military impacts on the island, and the notion that the island and the mainland are linked or bridged. Today, Horse Island retains its strategic importance, but in a unique cultural and environmental setting of significance to multiple nations. Recently, Chief Carr visited the Horse Island mainland, Rocky Shore, where she placed tobacco, recognizing this significant place to her ancestors. Chief Carr is from the Mississaugas of Rice Lake, Hiawatha Nation, in the Mississauga Anishinaabe territory in Ontario, Canada. Her gesture at the Horse Island mainland end of the causeway speaks to the Hiawatha First Nation values statement, which ends with this notion, quote, a healthy way of life through the teachings passed down from ancestors, end quote. And I think this is a perfect example of our shared heritage and our shared future. Thank you. Do we have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Indigenous artifacts found on the island?
Not with this survey, but they have been found in and around the village.
So was there a settlement or summer place?
Indigenous people usually just came and went seasonally for hunting and fishing. Yes, and then went back to central New York area where the climate was a little better.
Weren't there quite encampment of indigenous people on Point Peninsula?
Oh, yes, there's the Point Peninsula culture, right? And then there are the mounds near Perch Lake. Right?
So that there wasn't traffic in that direction?
Well, it went all along the shoreline. And I think if you've attended any of Ken Knapp's presentations, he really goes into that in great deal.
I saw a barge to the west of the causeway the other day. Is that working on the
There's a lot
project?
There's a lot of work going on to install public docks. There'll be a public dock, well, actually was installed this year on the, if you're facing the island for the mainland, one on the right, which has been taken out for the season now. And then they're working on finishing the one on the left to make sure everything's okay. And that'll be removed as well for the winter.
Are there trails?
There are trails on the island that the Martin families created. They had horses on the island. So they have a number of trails and those will be maintained and there'll be a map. So when you arrive on the island, you'll be able to see that. And the map will probably be on the park's websites as well.
This slides back to showing a small rocky, it looked like a little island made of large rocks.
Oh, yes,
Is that
yes.
part of the causeway?
Well, in one of the images, you could see the rocky causeway above the water level from the mainland out. But there was another image, which is actually to the west of the island. I think it might have been with a kayak in it. And that was actually created by the Martin family as a duck blind. Yeah, the archaeologists really questioned that. And then we called the Martin family members and they said, oh no, that was not War of 1812, that was our duck blind.
Was the utilization of GIS for the location of all of the shots,
Mhm.
is that widely used in, I mean,
It's
I'm referring to
used-
that because to
Yeah.
show the positioning of where people were and where their spent shot was perhaps fired from.
Right, right. So that's being used more for analyzing battlegrounds. Archaeologists are doing that much more so. A number of years ago, there was another study done on the mainland of the mainland battlegrounds by Hartkin archaeologists. They used different approaches then, but very similar. So it's quite helpful. But those are assumptions as well, too. Which is what's interesting about looking at the battle history is that you're looking at those firsthand accounts. Sometimes the accounts, though, that are not exactly firsthand, but maybe a few years later. And then you're looking at the military records. You're looking at the report. I mean, what did Jacob Brown have to say? Well, he, spun the battle in his perspective. And then you have the Jacques Viget, who wrote beautifully about the battle. In fact, his whole reminiscence is in the Jefferson County Historical Society's journal. It was published in the journal years ago. So there are a lot of wonderful resources. And then you begin to put those together and try and come up with your best assumption. Yes,
There was a prior battle, a year.
the first battle.
The first battle.
Yes.
And what was that about? Or I know what it's about, but how come this second battle was so decisive that it started the end of the war? Is that it?
No, the second battle, because of the various outcomes of the second battle, that's why the National Park Service looked at it as important, because it caused a delay of control of the lake. And the other important aspect for Sackets Harbor is that so much of the battlegrounds are still undeveloped. So when the National Park Service did their ranking, that's why Sackets Harbor became so high, is because the integrity of the battlegrounds in quite a bit is still as it was undeveloped. So that was very important.
But the first battle.
And the first battle was in July 19 of 1812. It was one of the first battles actually during the war. And the Canadian Provincial Marines came over on a Sunday morning, fired a few cannonball at the village. There's very little historical accurate documentation about the first battle. There are wonderful legends. There are many, many great legends about the first battle of Sackets Harbor. So that's a whole nother story and another presentation, but really great legends that came out of that first battle. We would love to find firsthand documentation, something that, gives us something more factual.
And what precipitated the second battle?
The second
was
battle,
Toronto, they were.
well, our
attacking
troops
Toronto.
had gone to attack York, Toronto. And so everybody was off in that direction, which left the village and the military very supposedly undefended and weak. And so the Crown forces determined, they came and looked it over and then said, oh, this would be a great time to attack because there's nobody there.
Yeah.
So, and then there were a variety of elements in that battle. The weather played a role. The officers' decision-making or not decision-making, the loss of command with the Crown forces, many, many different things come into play there. When we do the staff rides, military staff rides, we have a gentleman who does that, and it's 2 hours long. So he talks about the origin of the War of 1812 and where Sackets Harbor fits into that. But then for an hour and a half, you are walking the route of the battle from our historic site a mile down to the Horse Island Landing and back. And he's talking for that whole time. So there's a lot to say about the second battle of Sackets Harbor.
And where is the graveyard for the Canadian or for the British troops? Where?
We wish we knew. We do not know, but we do know from the documentation, because Jacob Brown said, we will bury the men. So we know they were buried, we just don't know where. So during the War of 1812 bicentennial, when we decided to do a monument to the Crown Forces, to those men, because we know the names, we picked a location that seemed sort of central, near where we believe the battle began to fluctuate a bit, a little rise in the land where the monument is. And if you stand at that location, you have sort of a 180-degree view of the battleground. And so we thought that that would be the best location for the monument.
That's on the island,
No, that is on the mainland.
on the mainland?
Yes. So during the bicentennial, we did 2 monuments. We did the one year to the Crown Forces, and then the next year we did one to the American troops. So if you're coming from the village proper and the historic site down the Shore Road, Ontario Street, you'll first come to the American Monument, and then there's an S-curve, and on the S-curve inland is the Crown Forces Monument. It's a flat ledger with their names engraved, and then a vertical granite monument.
Mhm.
When you started to talk about the beginning of the battle, you talked about these 2 different attacks, and there were only like 1 or 2 rounds fired or something.
Oh,
Is that how
yes.
long things usually lasted?
Well, because it was, we did not have a strong force opposing, that the plan was that we would be withdrawing, but it was a planned withdrawal. It was not a retreat. So that was planned. We knew that they would land on Horse Island because at the other end near the harbor is a very high cliff. Of those of you familiar with the village, a very high cliff, 20, 30 feet. And then there was a cannon at Fort Tompkins, which was on the bluff overlooking the harbor. And then across the harbor in what is today Madison Barracks, there was Fort Pike. So there was also artillery over there. So the crossfire would have protected the harbor. So then the only logical place to land was going to be Horse Island. And the west side was chosen, but then the wind changed and they were actually receiving fire from Fort Tompkins, from the cannon, which was firing a mile and actually hit one of the boats, one of the bateaux. So then the plan changed, and then the militia, they were all lined up on the shore because the others had retreated off of Horse Island. So it was a little skirmishing on the island, getting then everybody on mainland so the Crown Forces could then, form up. So the militia tried to delay. They one round they fired, but they were also untrained, undisciplined, and so they ran. Now McNitt, his group, then stayed and fought. They kept planning their withdrawal, but McNitt gets really more. He should get more credit for what he ended up doing, which of course they did because he ended up being in charge of the lighthouse. And he got a presentation story, which is actually at the Buffalo and Erie County Historical Society.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You're welcome.